Good afternoon, and I just want to say it's an incredible privilege to be speaking with you. And I would actually call it humbling. So many officials, public school officials, elected officials, and so many motivated parents. I really am humbled. And I sincerely want to thank Catherine Welch and all of you for inviting me to share just a few words with you. And I'd like to thank Kushan for the kind words of introduction. But I think the careful readers among you have to admit it. When you looked at that program, I think most of you might have noticed one small fact, that I apparently sued Superintendent Easton some time back. Yes, I did. We sued the California Department of Education, the State Board, a local school district down in the peninsula because they weren't serving their kids with disabilities in a fair and just way. Sorry about that, but not really. Not really. The good news is after a good many years of implementing a consent decree and a school reform plan in that case, that district is finally serving its kids in a mostly fair, equitable, and even lawful way. And that case actually exemplifies what a small and motivated group of parents who deploy both community organizing and even litigation to ensure that the rights of their children are established and honored. I want to be clear, there was no magical Silicon Valley solution down there in that school district. Although Al Gore did come and wire some schools, the guy who invented the internet. That was some years ago. And there was nobody like a Michelle Rhee who came in and fired all the teachers and made the schools better on a white horse. No, it was a bunch of parents and community members with good old-fashioned grassroots engagement and rights-based advocacy, and that's what I want to talk about. How we as Californians, how you as educate our state, can work for the most disadvantaged kids. One thing I want to be clear about, I'm not a Chicken Little. The sky is not necessarily falling with regard to our schools. In fact, we've done a lot of good work on the policy front with our schools in recent years, and we've made a great deal of progress. We educate more kids than ever, and we educate a more diverse body of kids than ever. But we still haven't cracked that one incredibly tough nut. The unconscionable education quality and achievement gap that falls most directly on poor kids, English learners, African American kids, and Latino kids. And I know that before I really get going, I have to issue a caveat. I know that I'm talking to some of the most motivated, equity-minded, and education-crusading folks out there. So it makes me a little nervous that I'm going to sound self-righteous or pedantic or maybe just preaching to the choir. And I know you get it. Education is a right. But what I also guess is that we assume that others get it. And that's not true. So what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to take away from this a language and maybe even a way to frame your fight and to help you do what you already do. So with that ambition in mind, I'd like to first focus on the first word of the talk, reclaiming. It seems to suggest that education once enjoyed the status of a civil right. Well, not really. You can scour the US Constitution and you're not going to find the word education in there. And the US Supreme Court underscored education's absence from the pantheon of protected rights in the infamous Rodriguez case, which countenances wide education funding disparities among schools. So it's not in the law books, but the law doesn't square with our experience and the historical facts on the ground. It's no accident that the NAACP Legal Defense Fund chose education as the battleground for its assault on Jim Crow. And by mid-century, it was already clear that for any individual child to compete in our modern economy and to participate in our complex civic institutions, she needed basic educational equality. And the Supreme Court acknowledged as much in saying that it's the principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values. In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed if he is denied the opportunity of an education. And so was established for a time the civil rights status of education, from desegregated schools to the enactment of Title I for educationally disadvantaged kids to some of the landmark school finance litigations. For about 20 years or so, education reform was driven by a moral imperative and civil rights rhetoric. But that, folks, has been over since at least about the 1980s. Indeed, since the Reagan administration's declaration that we're a nation at risk, education has become an economic imperative, not a moral imperative. And the phrase education as a civil right sounds quaint to some, I would say, or maybe even shrill to some ears. And since then, education policy has been driven by the values of efficiency and market-based strategies. How do we get the most for our educational buck? Not what do our students actually need to succeed? So take the school choice movement. From vouchers to tuition tax credits to charter schools, consumer choice has thrived. Indeed, LA Unified is the nation's largest charter authorizer today. Big footnote here. I'm a vocal and a full-throated charter supporter. I very much support the idea of a local group of parents and educators getting together and deciding how best to educate their own children. I even support the idea of rescuing children from failing schools and allow them choice to get out of their failing schools. In fact, the beauty of the charter movement is that it combines an unrepentant, big-spending liberal like myself with the free market Friedmanites who support charters as a political force. But let's be clear, charter theory is based on ideas of individual autonomy, choice, and competition. And beyond school choice, the market has shown its greatest strength through the nebulous force of accountability. Now, standards-based reform, when it was conceived, had the theory and the idea that what we needed to do was raise expectations for all kids, and that we should measure their performance, something that we didn't do in the past. And once we did that, once we saw where failure was, we could provide more resources to those kids, give them the opportunity to learn. But what happened on the way to NCLB was that the standards-based reform movement was hijacked by the accountability crowd. And at its core, accountability assumes that our schools possess the resources and the capacity to serve kids well, and that the leaders in those schools just need a good ass kicking to make sure that they serve those kids well. Maybe, maybe not. But why don't we first try to give those folks the resources to do their jobs? Why don't we help them do their jobs first? And then we can decide whether or not they need to be held accountable for not being able to do those jobs. I could talk about blood and turnips and all that sort of thing, but that's the idea here. So, through all of this market-based reform, accountability, and some of the technological innovations that we've seen, and the idea that we can actually take educating away from our teachers and put it all online, something that I don't think is going to work anytime in the near future, we've seemed to have lost the ability to talk about education as a civil right. And we do have a long way to go here. And let me be clear, this is the part of the talk where I get to do something paradoxical. I get to bore you with some mind-numbing statistics because you've heard those numbers before, but I get to shock you because they are so incredibly scary. On the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the nation's report card, we continue to rank 46th and 47th in fourth grade reading and math. And there's still gigantic divides between groups of students in California. In eighth grade math, only 11% of our African American kids is proficient, and 15% of Latino students are proficient, while some 42% of white kids are proficient. And I can tell similar stories for English learners, children with disabilities, all of the groups that we need to pay attention to. And this should not be surprising to anybody given how little we spend on our schools. According to Ed Week's Quality Count survey, we rank 50th out of 51, that includes DC, in cost-adjusted per pupil spending. And what does this mean in dollars? Well, listen to these numbers. We spend about $8,341 per kid. Massachusetts spends $13,741 per kid, $5,000 more. New York spends $16,835 per kid. Okay, take that dollar difference and multiply it over one classroom. You can buy teachers, you can buy instructional aides, you can buy a lot of things with that money. In fact, you know, this is the embarrassing one. Texas spends $437 per kid more. I'm sorry to the folks in Texas. Texas spends $437 per kid more than we do, right? So what's the problem here? It's not because we're poor. We simply choose to spend a much lower percentage of our taxable income on education. In fact, we rank about 37th on education effort, education spending. And I guess that means we prioritize other institutional spending here. What is the problem? I guess when budgets get tight, when taxpayers don't see their money at work, and when the realities of majoritarian politics take hold, there's this uncomfortable gap between our professed value in equal educational opportunity and the effort that we put into education for all. Instead, we do look for solutions on the cheap: choice, accountability, technological innovation. And although these strategies have shown some success, and they do need to be part of the mix, they lack the moral force and the urgency to really ensure that our most disadvantaged kids receive a high-quality education. The minute we start talking about efficiency, costs, and benefits, and so forth, we're implicitly making trade-offs and saying that for some kids, there's a good enough level that we can afford. Stated differently, we've really stopped treating education as a civil right and started treating it just like any other good or service that needs to be doled out in an efficient way. And usually that means to the folks who can already afford it. So we need to reclaim education as a civil right. And what does that 21st century education civil rights strategy look like? Well, in my view, it's not your grandmother's or your father's civil rights movement. It doesn't focus on one major initiative. It doesn't employ only one advocacy strategy. And it doesn't look for short-term drama and fixes. On the contrary, I think it's rather modest, incrementalist, determined, and it's patient. And from my perspective, there's really three things that we need to think about when we reframe education as a civil right and reclaim that. First of all, the status quo politics needs to be disrupted. but it needs to be savvy disruption. We need to change the politics, not destroy them. And this means we're going to have to use multiple strategies to change the status quo. It might include mobilization and organization of local communities with old school strategies like door-to-door knocking, but new school technologies like that stuff there. And you're good at this stuff. It might include even targeted litigation. Lawsuits should never lead, but they can be a way to actually change the conversation and reframe the agenda. And then, of course, the media can catalyze politics. Second part, data collection, transparency, and reporting. We must demand that our school officials collect meaningful, actionable data. And the data must be disaggregated along the lines in the groups of kids that we care about. Only then, once reported, once transparent to all of you, can we actually take action based on those data. We've come a heck of a long way in that regard recently, and we just need to keep working. And then finally, we need to emerge with a new kind of politics that's grounded in the constant engagement of stakeholders in the practice of reform. What's our goal? Are we meeting those goals? If not, why not, and how do we fix it? This is the steady tinkering toward the success that we're after here. And today we actually see a great deal of that going on in California. You're involved with some of this work. For instance, at the local level, we all of a sudden have this new tool to work with, local control funding formula. And it's designed to basically represent or be a right for economically disadvantaged kids. It's a right for foster kids. It's a right for English learners to have more money in their local school. But it's not going to be effective unless you and we bird dog local control accountability plans and make sure that we hold local officials accountable. You know why? Because there is no state agency that's charged with doing that. There is no education czar who's going to hold districts accountable for how they spend that money. That's up to us to be bird dogging that. That means steady, constant engagement. What about disruption? Excuse me. I know that a couple of you here are involved with a path-breaking case called Coalition for Quality Education against California. It's the tandem case with the case that I work on called Roll Baswang against California, where we have the very immodest goal of having the state's very insufficient school funding system declared unconstitutional. Right now we're hung up in the appellate courts and we're hoping to move forward on that case, but the idea behind it is that politics as usual might know that there's a problem, but it cannot solve the problem. We need a disruptive force. In this case, it might be a lawsuit. We know that the real work begins afterwards. There are only political solutions to these problems, but having changed the politics, we hope that we can have a successful solution. So it really isn't your grandfather's civil rights movement. It's not civil disobedience. It's not mass protest. It's not reliance on charismatic leadership and high-profile lawsuits. But it's a civil rights movement it is a civil rights movement nonetheless, because it's driven by a no-compromise attitude. It's smart, it's adaptive, it plays as good an inside game as it plays an outside game, and most of all, it puts education at the top of the agenda again. Plus, I gotta say, it's a lot of fun to work with folks like you in making that stuff happen, so thank you.